eminent historian of the Middle East, the late Bernard Lewis, used to respond to requests for his opinion about the likely future course of events with a very succinct disclaimer. He would say, "I am neither a prophet nor a son of a prophet." Obviously, neither am I. So when we try to look at, think about what the future of the region might be after the end of the war, it obviously will depend on how the war ends, when it ends, and whether or not we even know that it has actually ended. From the Israeli perspective, the horrific massacre of up to 1,400 men, women, and children and babies, which was perpetrated by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, it constituted the most traumatic day in the country's history. Moreover, it triggered the ever-present collective memory of the genocidal slaughter of millions of Jews, which was perpetrated in part by Nazi Einsatzgruppen, who specialized in wholesale murder, torture, rape, and pillaging. And I would even add to that there were a number of elderly persons who personally escaped the Holocaust horrors, only to find themselves murdered in the last years of their lives by Hamas terrorists. So, as a result of this, of what happened on October 7th, Israeli society has put aside its deep internal divisions, the divisions that manifested themselves in the mass sustained protests over the last year, and has now united around a single goal: destroying Hamas physically and infrastructurally. For Israel, this is no less than an existential matter, a question of whether or not it can provide basic security for its citizens so that the country may thrive and survive over the long run. Now, if the destruction of Hamas is not achieved, if Hamas manages to survive and rebuild its forces and retain or regain its ability to rule over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, then there is likely to be further large-scale rounds of violence. And in fact, Hamas leaders have already promised as much. There's likely also to be an increase of violent Palestinian attacks emanating from the West Bank. Such an outcome would also embolden Hezbollah, which is currently trying to demonstrate its solidarity with Hamas by attacking Israeli targets in northern Israel. At the same time, it is also trying to avoid an Israeli response that would jeopardize its large arsenal of missiles and its powerful position within the Lebanese entity. Either way, each of these two endings raises any number of questions on what will come after that. Will Israel be stronger or weaker? Conversely, will the radical actors supported by Iran be stronger or weaker? And what might be the effects of each of these outcomes on the internal stability of Arab states that do not belong to the pro-Iran, pro-Islamist, pro-so-called resistance camp, particularly neighboring Jordan with its large Palestinian population? Assuming that Israel succeeds in the coming days and weeks in evicting Hamas from Gaza City and points north, and also essentially demolishing its military and governing infrastructure there, the Gaza region, in the short run, will be an even more desperate place, with up to 2 million persons crammed into buildings and tent camps in the southern end of the region, adjacent to the Egyptian border. There will be a dire need for immediate and large-scale humanitarian aid and concerted efforts to maintain and sustain basic needs for the coming rainy season and beyond. Efforts that would need to focus first and foremost in the health, education, economic, and nutritional spheres. Hamas, of course, will surely seek to survive in this undoubtedly chaotic environment, and it will seek to rebuild or maintain its influence, and hence it's likely to be the continued target of Israeli operations military operations in that area. Now, ideally, some kind of international coalition made up of willing European, Arab, and other states will eventually be established, together with local Palestinians and representatives of the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority, which was evicted from Gaza by Hamas in 2007. And this coalition will need to take charge of rebuilding the shattered region. Egypt, as the large state bordering the Gaza region, and hence the one with the most immediate interest in stabilizing the situation, will have to play an important role. Now, of course, achieving all of this will be a monumental task, a Herculean task. Now, although Hamas can be smashed politically and militarily, at least in the short and immediate terms, its fundamental idea, the destruction of the state of Israel and its replacement by a militant Islamist Palestinian state from the river to the sea, that idea will remain ever present. It will remain in people's minds, and it will be attractive to many embittered Palestinians. I should note here that Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza in 2005. In doing so, it dismantled 21 settlements and relocated its 8,000 inhabitants to Israel proper. Since then, over the last 18 years, Israel's strategy was to try and contain Hamas. This was to be done by a combination of carrots and sticks. The carrots included work permits, up to 20,000 work permits for Gaza laborers to work inside Israel, allowing massive funds from Qatar, especially, and elsewhere, to be funneled into the area for building development projects. And as Israel also participated in basic water and maintaining basic water and electricity services. The sticks, of course, included an external blockade, limited restrictions on movement in and out, and periodic military operations in response to Hamas attacks. The hope that in Israel, among the decision makers, was that Hamas would be sufficiently deterred and thus would eventually turn its attention and give priority to advancing the interests and the welfare of the Palestinian population at large. On October 7th, this strategy proved to have been a colossal failure. Whether or not Hamas will pay the price politically for having consciously brought down the full might of the Israeli military on the long-suffering Palestinian population remains to be seen. According to public opinion polls, up 80% of the population, of the Israeli Jewish population, holds Netanyahu as directly and primarily responsible for the debacle of October 7th. In any well-functioning democracy, this would mean his immediate removal simply by a no-confidence vote in the parliament. But it's more complicated here, and we see it's not happening yet. Netanyahu himself, as we know, is trying everything he can to minimize his own responsibility, to try to survive. Everything he has done, in fact, in the last year, establishing an extreme right-wing government that gave unprecedented power to ultra-religious and messianic Jewish supremacy and settlement advocates, his efforts to weaken the country's independent judiciary in the guise of a fraudulent judicial reform package, and his consistent ignoring of the advice of the country's defense and security elites, in a way, warnings that his actions were undermining dividing the country in a way that gave encouragement to the country's enemies. All of Netanyahu's steps have been guided by one overriding personal concern: to try to cancel the ongoing trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Everything he has done since the war has broken out, has been done with that in mind. However, the public's anger towards the entire civilian and military leadership over what happened on October 7th, and with him as the head, that anger is bubbling up, and large-scale demonstrations, particularly on behalf of the 240 kidnapped hostages being held in Gaza, those demonstrations are already taking place. And hence, however this phase of the war ends, however and whenever it ends, there is, in my view, there is likely to be literally a tsunami of public protest calling for Netanyahu's resignation and his replacement by a new government and elections, which is what you do in a democracy. Ultimately, I believe that this massive public pressure will be felt also within the political echelons and within members of his governing coalition, and that the pressure will be sufficient, and that his career will end in disgrace. On the eve of October 7th, a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement seemed to be just around the corner. For Netanyahu, this would have been the ultimate feather in his cap, proving to skeptics that Israel's relations with Arab countries was not dependent on resolving the Palestinian issue. In fact, one of the motivations for Hamas's actions at this point in time was to prove the fallacy of that thesis, and it succeeded in doing so. Israel's relations with the Gulf members of the Abraham Accords, I speak here about Bahrain and the Emirates, those relations will be, at best, conducted discreetly until the dust settles, and not advanced further. And they may even be frozen. And the contacts with the Saudis, who detest the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, will be even more discreet and if not frozen. As for Morocco, the authorities there, in where you're sitting, Mohammed, to me, the authorities seem to be in a hunker down mode. That is to say that barely commenting on the events, from what I know, not participating in regional diplomatic efforts at this point, and allowing public demonstrations in support of the Palestinians and in opposition to normalization. The hope, I believe, obviously, is that there won't be further pressure on the government, the Moroccan government, to act against its own strategic and economic interests that underpinned the normalization of Moroccan-Israeli relations over the last few years. Iran has projected power into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula regions in a way not seen since the centuries just before the rise of Islam. Iranian empires, pre-Islamic empires, reached the Eastern Mediterranean, and more than 1,500 years later, Iran's influence is heavily felt, as we all know. Iran is actively guiding its proxies in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen to take action against Israel and in support of Hamas. At the same time, it is willing to fight to the last Arab soldier, but not more. And I say that cynically, but I think that it is absolutely true. So, what to do? Hence, in my view, Iran needs to be warned of the consequences of escalation that would result in a full-scale regional war, which I do not believe that Iran is interested in. It's certainly not interested in participating in such a regional war. The U.S. has done this. It has issued this warning demonstratively, not just by words, but also by deeds, moving its forces into the region, its aircraft carriers, etc. Israel has issued similar warnings. And so far, the message seems to have been received and understood in Iran. A possible resetting, and this is my last comment, a possible resetting of Israeli-Iranian relations apparently will have to wait until the Gaza and Lebanese arenas are stabilized and until new and wiser leaderships arise in both countries.